Senator from Missouri.
Well, Mr. President, I'm disappointed that the process has failed us in the last week. For my friends in the House and the Senate who, like I did when we ran for these jobs, said we'd do everything we could possibly do to not go down this path of where government gets between people and their doctor. Those are heartfelt views. Those are sincere views. Those are views that if we were in the majority, frankly, and if we had a president on our side, we would have already taken care of. But for those who mistakenly thought that if we didn't have any appropriations bill, that somehow the president's health care plan wouldn't move forward, we see today that was a mistaken view of what would happen. Most of the president's health care spending is mandatory. It's something that the Congress doesn't even vote on. The way not to move forward is to change the law. But, Mr. President, we've not had any opportunity to change this law. Didn't have an opportunity when you and I served in the House together to change the law. This is a law that never was amendable on the floor of the Senate or the House. Now, it's hard to imagine that we have decided to restructure 1/16 of the whole economy and everybody's health care relationships without ever having a chance to amend the law. So surely, my friends on the other side who voted for this bill or who have been supportive of this law, surely they understand the frustration that we have when there's never been a possibility to bring an amendment to the law and say, let's see if we couldn't make this part of it work better. So what was the amendment yesterday? The amendment yesterday to the law that the House offered the Senate, the principal amendment was, let's not have the individual penalty for a year. The president on his own decided we wouldn't have the corporate penalty for a year, that wouldn't have the business penalty for a year. This is sort of a strange place for us to wind up. We're on this side of the Senate, we're saying, don't give job creators, we like to talk about job creators on this side of the Senate aisle, don't give job creators a break and not give people working at those jobs a break. The president on his own apparently can amend the law without us. Now, this is also pretty unusual, Mr. President, that the president on his own, without us, thinks he can amend the law, but we have no avenue to amend the law. The president on his own said, we're going to eliminate the corporate penalty. We're going to say that for this first year, businesses that have more than 50 employees don't have to offer insurance or pay a penalty. That's what the law says was supposed to happen on January 1. But the president said, no, we're not going to do that. That's too hard to do. We're going to take a $12 billion hit in funding this program because that's what the estimated penalties might have been. And frankly, that may have been low because a lot of businesses that were offering insurance, I think, will not be offering insurance when we get into the requirement to offer insurance. And so I think that was probably a low number, but it was a number. It was $12 billion. Our friends in the House sent something over here that said, okay, if we're going to waive $12 billion, let's waive $4 billion. Let's waive the penalty for individuals if they don't have insurance. And by the way, many of those individuals were led by this law to believe they'd get insurance at work. But the president said, there's no penalty for not offering insurance at work for this first year, but we're still going to penalize individuals who don't have it. So if you're an individual out there and for whatever reason you can't afford, don't get insurance, you're going to have a $95 penalty the first year, and it goes up after that. That was a chance to amend the law in the right way. The House would have voted, the Senate would have voted, the president would have signed a bill. Imagine that. The House votes, the Senate votes, the president signs a bill. I think that's the way the process is supposed to work. And how we could have a $12 billion waiver for the employer and have a $4 billion penalty for the employee just doesn't make any sense to me. This law was not amendable, so sure, would it be better not to be trying to amend it on a resolution to support the government? Absolutely, that would have been better. Would it have been better for the Senate to pass a single appropriations bill of the 12 that are supposed to be passed before the spending year begins? Absolutely, that would have been a lot better. Would it have been better for the Senate to prioritize anything? Now, Senator Mikulski, the chairman of my committee, the Appropriations Committee was mentioned earlier, the committee voted out most of the bills, some of them on a partisan vote, some of them on a bipartisan vote, but only one of them got here, and it was one the leader knew couldn't possibly pass. So we haven't passed one bill. Would have been better to do it that way. We wouldn't be at this moment if, in fact, we had passed the appropriations bills and agreed with the Senate. And then the majority leader talks about the hardworking chairman of the Budget Committee and says, we can't do our work because we don't have a budget conference. Well, last year the majority leader was saying we don't even need a budget. Now we can't. It's too late for the budget. The spending year has begun. That was months ago when that should have happened. And why didn't that happen? Because the House passed a budget that obeyed the law. And the law says we can't spend more than $967 billion. That's the law, like it or not. Just like on my side of this discussion, ObamaCare is the law, like it or not. Now, apparently that's a law we have to enforce, but we don't have to enforce the Budget Control Act because the Senate budget was over $1 trillion, $1,038 billion was the Senate budget. Of course, you're not going to have an agreement if you're 70 or 80 billion dollars apart and one budget obeys the law and the other doesn't. Of course, you're not going to have an agreement on that. Republicans in the House essentially for a week now have been negotiating with themselves because there's nobody who's willing to negotiate. The president says negotiating on the debt ceiling is blackmail. Never been blackmail before. In fact, we wouldn't have the Budget Control Act if we hadn't negotiated on the debt ceiling. So it's blackmail to negotiate. You know, this is a process where actually the House, the Senate, and the President are supposed to work together to move forward. The budget, the debt ceiling has been used over and over again to talk about spending. It's been used a number of times to talk about things that weren't spending. And usually by Congresses controlled by Democrats with Republican presidents. And they say, well, okay, the president doesn't want to talk about this issue without the debt ceiling. We're just going to add it to the debt ceiling discussion. But more often than that, it's been used to talk about spending. If you go to your banker and said, I've spent all the money you've given me, I've used up my line of credit, I'd like to extend the line of credit, I guarantee you your banker's going to say, well, either no, you've already exceeded what we told you you could borrow from us to spend, or if we're going to do that, let's talk about your spending habits. Show me a plan that means you're going to spend differently in the future than you spent now. But the president says that's blackmail. More than anybody else in the United States of America, the president of the United States is in a position to look at what he's for and figure out what he's for that the Congress would be willing to do. That is not happening. That has not happened. There is plenty of blame for the fact that there's no funding today, but there are also plenty of victims of that. Everybody who depends on the government is a victim of that. Social Security checks are going to go out, but you can't apply for Social Security if you don't have it. If your check is lost or didn't go out, you can't find out why that happened. People in harm's way, the border control agents, the immigration and customs enforcement people are out there, but their paycheck for their family's not coming in. And how could we have solved that yesterday? One of the ways we could have solved that, I'm confident, is by saying, okay, we won't collect this $4 billion from individuals, just like we're not collecting the $12 billion from companies. The reason this health care law continues to be such a problem is it was never amendable, it was never discussed. Even the president says, as he does some of these unilateral things, if this was a normal circumstance, I'd go to Congress and ask them to change the law, but it's not a normal circumstance. I can't find that anywhere in the Constitution where the president gets to decide if the Constitution applies or doesn't apply. Everybody is to blame here because the Congress is not doing the work the Congress is supposed to do, and the president's not leading, and Americans are going to suffer because the Congress and the president haven't done their job. I would yield the floor.